Today, if the Lord wills, we will get through chapters 9, 10, and half of 11, and finish the book off next weekend. And then Keith, again, Lord willing, will give the lesson 3 Sundays from now, 2 after this one, and then William will have a series. We are not going to read verse through verse for this portion of the text. The large reason being is that many of the things that we've encountered, we've already sort of given an explanation of. So I think it would be best use of our time if we focused on certain verses that are giving certain themes and looking at what are the practical applications for us from those verses. I encourage you to read verse through verse this text on your own time at some point, but we won't be doing a verse-by-verse exposition, because I don't think that's the best use of our time for this lesson. What we'll be focusing on, largely, is, for the practical applications, is finishing off what Solomon has to say about work, but not just physical work. I want us to apply what Solomon has to say and see how can we apply it to our spiritual work as well. So one thing we've noticed over and over again is there is no doubt that work is part of our life. Solomon has a lot to say on it. And in fact, man's purpose, original purpose, was work. It's with a very different nature than the type that we do today or are used to. But even if you turn back to Genesis chapter 2, and verse 5, you'll notice that it says, before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. So the garden that God had created, there was the intent that man would till the ground, that there would be something that he was doing while he was in the garden. And of course, Eve was created to help him in that function. So there was a task that was given by God even in the garden. Now, of course, that task becomes frustrated, and there's thorns in the ground because of the sin that Adam had committed. But that work is there. Is it different for us? And we know, of course, for our own work today, that we still need to in order to eat, but there is also the fulfillment of a purpose. Friends, it's no different in our spiritual life. Could God have created the garden and put Adam in it, and there have been no need, no role for Adam in it? Yes, he could have. Could God have enacted the plan of salvation and people be saved separate and apart from us carrying the gospel message? Of course, God can design something any way he wants. But as Paul said, he has decided to put this treasure in earthen vessels. There is a role that we play in God's plan of salvation. And friends, there is an incredible amount of work for us to do. If you go and turn to John chapter 4, this is the scene at the well. And this would be a great lesson all by itself, just to look at that. But I want us to call our attention to the latter part. The disciples, the reason why Jesus was alone at the well with the woman, it was the disciples had gone to get food. Then they come back. And in the meantime, his disciples urged him, saying, verse 31, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat of which you do not know. Therefore the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him anything to eat? Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to finish his work. Do not say, there are still 4 months, and then comes the harvest. Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. And he who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life, that both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this, the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labors. There's so much in what Jesus says here. He's saying, look, there's a lot of work to be doing. and to be going about. And that has not changed. The fields are as white for harvest now as they were then. And we all have a role to play in that. He talks about he who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life, that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. Paul planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. Paul has to say. There's different roles that we may have, and yet they are both important to making sure that this reaping happens. Jesus uses farming metaphors because they are so well understood. In that time, the majority profession was farming. Even today, there is still a fair amount of farming that goes on. The concept is relatively easy for us to understand. But what is our role? Would be a whole different lesson in helping us to determine what it is. But whatever it is as equally important to the work, whether we're reaping, whether we're sowing, whether we're watering, whether we're the person that tills the ground to remove rocks, whether we're the ones that go ahead and make sure that weeds don't come in, whether we're the ones that thin out things so that the other crops can come in, we're the ones that fertilize, or the ones that assist those that are doing the work. And the laborers, that's hard work. Making sure that they've got fresh water, fresh food, they've got everything they need so they can continue on with the work. All of those things are important. But there is no doubt that God has work spiritually intended for us. He says as much in the often not quoted next part of Ephesians chapter 2. Everyone loves quoting verse 8, and it's a good verse. I'm not saying that it isn't. It needs to be quoted often. There's no doubt about that. But we need to also remember verse 10. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Verse 10, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. God didn't just redeem us for the sake of redeeming us. God redeemed us and has work in mind for us to be doing and to be about. So that work, our role, can take many different manifestations. Let's start in the Ecclesiastes text with 9 and verse 10 and establish some principles about our work, both physical and spiritual. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. I heard this expression when I was growing up as a kid. I've heard it as an adult. It is great advice. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Whatever your role is in the church, whatever your role is in the world, do the best job that you can. Put your hand to it. Do not do a job half-heartedly, as they say. We have the added motivation in that Paul says in both Colossians and Ephesians that those that earn wages, he talks about slaves or bondservants, but it applies to us as well, that we work as to the Lord. We have to remember that the work that we're doing in the world isn't just about ourselves and the physical perspective. Jump forward to chapter 10 and verse 10. These are all pieces of advice that Solomon is really giving to workers now. If the axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success. Now, the job will still get done. If a person is using a dull axe, this job will still get done. But I'm going to tell you, the person is going to have to put a lot more, and Solomon says this, of their own personal strength into it. And they're going to have to, and it's going to take longer. The smarter thing to do would be to take the time to stop and to sharpen the axe, or even perhaps replace the whole head if it's maybe old enough where it can't even really be sharpened anymore. What Solomon is saying is an expression that we use today: work smarter, not harder. That applies to the physical world. If the person has a sharpened axe, they're going to have to put a lot less of their own elbow grease into getting wood chopping or whatever it is that they're doing done. Working smarter is better than just merely working harder. We go to verse 4, chapter 11 and verse 4. More to say about this. Sorry, verse 5 and 6 is what I wanted to combine that with. As you do not know what is the way of the wind. Chapter 11, verse 5 and 6. As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good. So, what's Solomon saying here with work? What is the application to ourselves? There's certain things we don't know. That's just a given. And that is in verse 5. Just likewise, we don't know in our work what avenues may bring success. I've seen people use this verse in modern times to talk about the way we might have our investments with money. The banks recommend, you diversify your portfolios. I said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't put them all in one sector, say the financial, say the energy sector. The energy sector has a downturn, your entire portfolio will stumble in value. If you got some stuff in the resource extraction sector, if you got stuff in the finance sector, et cetera, you'll generally be better off. That is an application, I think, that is in there. What can we take from about the axe being dull and not knowing what can prosper, and spiritual applications to our own work within the church? Let's say this. We don't know which one of our methods and which one of our contacts may yield the best results. Let's not make assumptions. When we go and approach people with the gospel, let's make sure that we're not prejudging one person as, I don't really think that contact's going to work out. I don't really think that person is going to listen to the gospel. I'm going to spend all my time with this person over here and kind of forget about that person. Make sure that we are not showing partiality in who we go ahead and we attempt to share the gospel with, because we don't know ultimately which one may respond. That is, and John has used this analogy before, the parable of the sower. The sower indiscriminately casts his seed along. He's not a soil tester. It lands on different soils, different hearts, but the sower is not sitting there analyzing each one of the types of soil before he starts casting. He casts, it lands in a different places. Some are successful, some are not. God sow that seed as broadly as possible. But is it possible that we can work smarter? I think sometimes it's helpful for us to evaluate, what are we doing to spread the gospel to our friends, neighbors, and family? And could we be doing it more effectively? Are we using a method that is equivalent of the dull axe? And we're working maybe hard, but not necessarily smart. I'm not saying this to pat ourselves on the back, but I think it's a good thing that we have tried many different approaches. We've tried the radio advertisements, we've tried the Facebook ads, we've tried the flyer inserts, we've tried direct door-to-door with flyers, we've tried leaving hang-ups in the laundromats, we've tried the meetup, all of these different methods, and some have proven themselves to be more successful than others. But I think that is an indication here, an application of that text, is there's all sorts of different avenues and technologies and methods at our disposal now. It's helpful for us to sit back occasionally and analyze, what are we doing to spread the gospel? And could we be doing it more effectively? Are we working with a dull axe? Are we using a method, prejudging it, and tossing it out and rejecting an opportunity that might be there because of it. Regardless, at one point in time, though, there are certain things, there's just a point where we have to just do the work. Verse 4, chapter 11. There's two different categories of this. Verse 4, chapter 11. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. Now, I don't think that this person is necessarily lazy. That person is covered in chapter 10 and verse 18. Because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. This is a person who spends too much time planning and not enough time working. So yes, there's a way that you can work smarter rather than harder. And there's a way that you can diversify and never know which might come back to you. But what Solomon is saying here, at some point in time, you just got to work. You just have to start doing something. If you sit there and observe the wind forever, trying to figure out what is the best time to sow, that's probably what this person is doing. What's the best time? The best time, the best time. They get obsessed with planning. They get obsessed with observing the wind. He who regards the clouds will not reap. What's the best day? What's the best possible day where I can reap my harvest now? Well, sometimes the best day doesn't come along. Sometimes you just have to make do with what is. And if you just sit there and forever hoping for the perfect condition to come along, that harvest might just sit there and rot in the ground because this person was regarding the clouds the whole time. At one point in time, that person just had to get up and start harvesting. They just had to get to the work at one point. Can we do the same? Can we become obsessed about the perfect thing to say? I know I have. I've got this opportunity to talk to this person about the gospel, but I want to make sure that it comes up in the conversation organically. I don't want to feel like it's just forced, or I got to really think what's the best possible thing I could say and stuff like that. And I think it is important for us to be careful about what we say. We've talked about that before. But sometimes saying something to somebody, whether it be an invitation, it doesn't have to be put eloquently, is better than the opportunity going by, because we never know when if that opportunity is the only opportunity that we have with that person. Sometimes it's better to just say something, even if it's not said the best and the most efficiently, rather than doing the spiritual equivalent of observing the wind forever and not sowing. John, I can't remember if it was you or if it was William, used to use an example that we were in Artillery Park about this fishing club that never went fishing. They called themselves fishermen. They would get together and they would talk about the best lures, and they would talk about the best rods, and they would talk about the best time to go fishing. They would talk about where certain types of fish were, what type of weather conditions it was, what type of river currents you could expect. And they talked about fishing all the time, but they never actually went fishing and never caught a fish. We can do that. We can do what Solomon is talking about in chapter 11, verse 4. If we sit there and we talk about the best thing to say, the best methods to preach the gospel and get contacts, but at some point in time, you just have to go and walk on the sidewalk and put cards in a mailbox. You just have to do whatever it is to get people in there. We can be inefficient like that person. If we're lazy like the person in verse 18, well, that's a whole different lesson on what to deal with. That will result in physical ruin. It will result in our spiritual ruin as well. Finally, we need to remember we are not in it alone. We've already looked at the twofold cord, and the threefold cord are not easily broken from earlier in the book. Solomon specifically has someone in mind in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 9. He says, "Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he has given you under the sun, all your days of vanity. For that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun." Solomon here says, and he's talking about a man with his wife, but it would work just as easily in the reverse with a wife with her husband, that relationship is a blessed relationship, needs to not be taken for granted, needs to be worked on, needs to be appreciated as much as the fruit of the labor that results from work. And oftentimes the two of them are more efficient together than if they were by themselves. We need to rely on each other's strengths and weaknesses in the church to help each other to spread the gospel efficiently. We need to appreciate our spouses. We need to appreciate our fellow workers. This is just incidental. Solomon had also said in Proverbs, he who finds a wife finds favor from the Lord, in Proverbs. I've always found it interesting that in this text and in Proverbs, you notice something. It's conspicuous by its absence. Live joyfully with the wife. He who finds a wife finds favor from the Lord. A man who had 300 wives and 700 concubines, when it goes to actually writing about the blessedness of the marital relationship, in both cases, and he has more, those are just the two that I'm referencing, there's more verses, in both cases talks about the wife, a wife. He never says in this text, live joyfully with the wives whom you love all the days of your vain life under the sun. Solomon, I think at his heart, knew that the better thing to do would have been to have one wife. He sees, maybe this late in his life, the folly of having been involved in that many relationships. He writes it in the singular, one. I found that very interesting, that the man that had that many women, when he chooses to mention the marital relationship, talks about it as if it's just the one in that relationship. Hopefully he came to his senses. We don't know that 100% for sure, but I'd like to think that he did. Finally, and Solomon has said this, go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart. It's not necessarily alcoholic wine. The Old Testament should be worth mentioning. The Old Testament, that word can be used for both alcoholic and just simply the fruit of the vine. And the context will often determine which it is. And even if it is alcoholic, it is not like the 12 and 13% that we often have. It would be closer to 0.5% to 2% as far as alcohol content by volume. Go and eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and your head lack no oil. Rejoice, in chapter 11 and verse 7 and 8, because these verses are very similar. Truly the light is sweet and is pleasant to the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man lives many years and rejoices in them all, let them remember the days of darkness, for there will be many. All that is coming is vanity. Enjoy, for all of that, at the end of it, working smart, taking advantage of opportunities, just getting it done, appreciating who you're doing the work with. And again, there is nothing wrong with us enjoying the fruit of our labors. If we put it in context, we can enjoy it now, but keep in mind that there's going to be a time when we cannot enjoy it anymore. Can we do that spiritually? Can we enjoy? We have to be careful about that. We don't want to rest on our laurels. We don't want to rest on the things that we did last year or last month. We don't want to boast. I don't think at the same time that it necessarily hurts for us to occasionally look at what has been accomplished and appreciate that and to want to do more of it. Not for the patting ourselves on the back, but for the realization that what we're doing is making a positive difference, and to let's do more of that. Let's use that to encourage and maintain momentum. Not to say, oh, I taught the gospel to 3, 4, 5 people in the last month. I'm so great. Nothing like that. This is going well. Let's continue doing that so that God can be glorified and people can see the gospel. Ultimately, we will receive our reward in heaven. I don't think that necessarily means that we cannot appreciate the result of good work for the gospel while we are on earth. Again, if we're not using it to boast or brag. Within those chapters, I think those are the main things that Solomon is saying about work, and that is the majority of our lesson. There's a couple of other categories I'd like to call our attention to. If we have time to get through them, if not, I'll reference the verses and just give you the application very quickly. And go back to chapter 11 and verse 3. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. If a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. I think I referenced this verse in the first or second lesson and said that I had spent an awful lot of time considering what Solomon meant by if the tree falls to the south or the north, and trying to figure out, there's something special about the north? Is there something special about the south? What is the meaning of this? Well, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. It's going to happen. That is the end result of something. If a tree falls to the north, and it's fallen, and it's now lying facing north, it cannot, by definition, be lying and facing south. Solomon is simply saying here, some things just are. That's it. It's not, that is not to say that just because that application is simple, that there's no wisdom in it. In fact, there's a lot of wisdom in this verse because we have to accept and work around the fact that some things just are. You'll notice that the next thing he makes was the application, the verse that we saw before, he who observes the wind will not sow. You'll never have necessarily that perfect time. Some things are, just do it. For ourselves, there's some things in life that we just have to accept. Some of those things aren't necessarily pleasant things, such as what he describes in chapter 9, 11 and 12, and for the remainder of chapter 9. So if we go back to chapter 9, he says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. For man also does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. So the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. Solomon, as we've seen before, is the master of hyperbole to make his point. Generally speaking, the race is to the swift. You know I'm not going to enter the 100-meter dash in the Olympics. I wouldn't even qualify, but let's say that I did. We all know I'm not winning that event. We don't just know it. The idea is laughable. You have to train for years in order to be qualified for that event. You have to be in top physical condition. Somebody can't just show up and start running. Generally speaking, the race is to the swift. Battle is to the strong. Riches to men of understanding. A fool that just invests his money and has no understanding of the market and of how money works is not likely to come out being rich. Generally, it will go to the person who understands how the market works, understands how money works, understands how to save and spend and when to buy up their opportunities. But there are exceptions, and sometimes they are glaring to every rule. We have elections in the last, I'm not going to reference any specific one, thinking of races throughout Europe and other countries over the last year. There were people that were saying, so-and-so is definitely going to be the candidate. So-and-so is definitely going to win. There's no way that this other person can win. And that other person won. There are occasions when the natural order of things seemingly is upset and unbalanced by time and chance happening to them all. What the ultimate lesson is that, friends, we need to be ready. Look at what Solomon says in verse 12. He applies that ultimately to time and chance and the suddenness of events that can overtake us to the possibility of death. We do not know when that day or hour may come. So we need to be ready at all times. By the time that I'm done speaking, Christ could return. we need to make sure we are ready. It may be that Christ doesn't return today, and God willing, this does not happen to any of us, but some accident befalls us, and it is possibly the last day of our life, and that could just be time and chance. It could even be out of our control. Somebody bad driving and not paying attention could potentially end our life. We don't know when our time is, and that would be unfavorable time and chance. Sons of men are snared in an evil time. Evil here isn't necessarily moral. Sometimes evil is used in the sense of bad things happening. It's like evil things befell them. Doesn't necessarily mean morally evil in this case. An evil time because of the bad things that have happened. We need to make sure we are ready. We also need to recognize and accept. We talked about this a bit last week, to focus on the positive, because there are certain things in life that are just by their very nature negative. And the world would be a much better place if people could recognize certain things, but they don't. And this is what Solomon is talking about in chapter 9, verse 13 to 18. This wisdom I have also seen under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it, besieged it, and built great snares around it. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that same poor man. Then I said, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard, rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Wisdom, words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard, rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Can you imagine how much better the world would be right now and traditionally if people lived according to that? We have a lot of rulers now and over the last 50 years who have spoken with the shout of a fool, when it would have been better if the world listened. It would have been better if they had listened to the words of the wise spoken quietly. But that's not the way the world works. Even when that quiet man saves the day, verse 13, 14, and 15, he is despised and rejected because the world judges people according to appearance. He might be wise, but he's poor. So we're not going to listen to him. He's a nobody. We'll listen to somebody's. Doesn't matter that the nobody here saved the day and has the wisdom. That is better than the wisdom, weapons of war. The world, according to the way that they judge, rejects that person. We need to accept, unfortunately, at times that is the way the world is, and deal with the world the way it is rather than the way that we would like it to be. That is at the center of our being patient when we teach. It's at the center, I believe, of understanding that we can't change the way that the world is and the way that people are, but we can focus on the positive. And we can choose to be the person that listens to the quiet words of the wise rather than the shout of fools. The rest of them can listen to the shout of fools. Let's make sure we're the ones that listen to the quiet, humble words of the wise man instead of the shouts of fools. The next few verses, I think we have an opportunity to get through them. The next few verses don't necessarily fit into any of the categories that we just spoke of, but I think that they're very good for us to still look at. Chapter 10, verse 1 and 2. Dead flies putrefy the perfume's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. We talked about reputation and the importance of reputation, and that sometimes that's all we have in this life a couple of lessons ago. This goes along with that. And the ointment, the perfumer's ointment, gives off a pleasant odor, but something has dropped into it and has rotted in there, and now the whole thing, the whole smell is foul. The oil has been ruined by it. One that has wisdom and righteousness, a little bit of sin in that person's life and folly can destroy that person. a little leaven leavens the whole lump and can destroy our reputation. We need to be on guard against that, to make sure that we don't destroy ourselves and destroy our reputation. I like this metaphor is that Solomon uses, a visual of it, and is quite powerful. I think there's quite the evocative image here of what's exactly happened. Jump to verse 20. Do not curse the king even in your thought. Do not curse the rich even in your bedroom, for a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. We have spoken extensively that Solomon deals in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs with sins of the tongue a lot. Here is one that are always words to live by. Do not curse the king even in your thought. A bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. If we are prone to being ones that talk when we shouldn't talk, this is a good verse to remember. It is the Old Testament equivalent of an expression that we have, these walls have ears, and you never know what might get back around and come back to haunt us later on. It's better to live by that old adage of, you've got nothing good to say nothing at all. Saying nothing can't get back to somebody. Saying something, it can get carried by the wind. Somebody you don't think is hearing can hear, and it will get back, and we will have regrets because of that. Good wisdom to live by, both in our physical life and in our spiritual life. Finally, we will conclude with the beginning portion of chapter 11. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. Be generous with what we have. Be willing to lend and to give. Solomon says in Proverbs, he who lends to the poor lends to the Lord. Do not mock the poor. He who mocks the poor mocks his maker, that is God. Casting your bread upon the waters. Generally speaking, if you don't notice that sometimes when you throw something out to sea, the currents oftentimes can bring it right back to the very place that it was thrown from. If we are generous, generally speaking, that can come back to us. We don't give with the intent of necessarily receiving something back. Jesus talks about the Pharisees in that regard. They only throw dinner parties for those that they know will invite them back. But oftentimes, those that are generous in life, when they fall upon hard circumstances, people they helped often will help them in return. And you never know what can happen. That's what Solomon is saying here. You don't know what evil will be on the earth. You don't know when you'll be the one that needs help. So always be willing to help others. Many of what we've looked at today as practical applications for us. Next week, we will finish, Lord willing, off the book, starting in verse 9 of chapter 11, and then going through chapter 12, where Solomon makes the application, the biggest application of his book, and the lessons that we can take from that. We have